Rational demand avoidance versus irrational demand avoidance split is inherently biased by Richard Woods at London Southbank University, PhD student, and I'm currently on an extended gap year. So, this video should probably be about 4 to 5 minutes long. It's basically just a quick introduction into the claims rational demand avoidance versus irrational demand avoidance split. I'm going to be discussing that they're inherently subjective. And that basically is a false binary, and this end with some reflective questions. So, yeah, originally back in 2017 and 2019, Damien Milton and later I said there are good reasons for autistic people to often express demand avoidance, and that's like good is in quotation marks because again, what is good is obviously subjective as well. So later on, it has been kind of claimed that what is PDA demand avoidance is different from rational demand avoidance, and therefore that PDA's demand avoidance is inherently irrational in nature. So there's this, it's just kind of represented in, first it was Easton Weaver 2020. PDA Society has later kind of made this claim in its what it claims to be a clinical document, which I think is a high-biased research report. And many autistic PDAs obviously also advocate for this claimed rational demand avoidance versus irrational demand avoidance split. So, for example, C means by Sally Cat. I'll put relevant links to documents and videos in the description, so people are going to check out like the sources for this. So, yeah, I said there's this proposed dichotomy between what is rational versus irrational demand avoidance, with like non-PDA demand avoidance being rational, and then irrational demand avoidance represents PDA demand avoidance. I'll point out that me and Damien Milton never intended for rational demand avoidance to be used this way, or to be used to exclude people from the PDA category. So, yeah. It's also been pointed out in the PDA literature that the PDA descriptions are mainly defined by observer bias, so therefore would be like white, middle class, straight, male value judgments. So what is kind of irrational and what is classed as irrational is inherently subjective. So yeah, it also matters in terms of kind of different cultures will tend to have different values. So what each kind of culture views as being rational or ordinary is subjective and varies from culture to culture. So, for example, the autistics will tend to use for pause instead of clapping, while non-autistics will tend to clap at the end of speeches and etc. etc. Just as kind of really, it is kind of really pertinent example I would argue is that back in the Soviet Union times, they would define well they would often define dissidents, people who objected to the Soviet regime, as being mentally ill because you're meant to be living in paradise. So if you disagree with living in paradise, you're obviously mentally ill. And that's just a way of pointing out that from a Western perspective, it's quite rational and logical to object to and disagree with the Soviet Union at the time and communism and stuff, but obviously within it, less so. So yeah, this is a personal example because the people who were viewed as being mentally ill because they objected to communism and Soviet Union, they were like treated as such within the kind of Soviet system and like put into like hospitals or units and stuff. So yeah, not good. There's a more practical element. If one is going to try and decide what is rational or irrational, there's a few possibilities over what result one can get. One can get that the demand avoidance is neither rational or irrational in nature. You can have it being demand avoidance being solely rational or solely irrational, and then one can have that demand avoidance is both irrational and rational in nature. There's also ignore that logic for this is on slide 55. I'll put a link to the actual original slides and videos in the description so people can find it there. So yeah, there's a fifth option, which is just avoiding deciding if demand avoidance is rational or irrational in nature. So one doesn't need to do this. One might prefer to do different things with their time and spoons than deciding if something is rational or irrational in nature. So, um, like, I mean, my preference would be just to focus on the fact that people are expressing significant demand avoidance and helping them. There's other rationale for it, such as one can argue it's poor practice and not in line with kind of more progressive autism research, for example, because there is cause to consider like cultural and kind of other contextual factors for kind of social interactions within autism research, and that there's growing evidence that what is typically medically defined as autism, like features that typically defined as being in, impairment and intrinsic individual, are actually a result of interactional processes. So interactional and transactional processes. So yeah. So we on to the reflective part, which is the final bit. So is it objective to describe something as being rational or irrational, and kind of why? And then like how would you approach describing demand avoidance as irrational or rational, and why? And then the final question is, what potential problems are using rational or irrational demand avoidance binary that's been put forward? If one stops to think about it, there's quite a few. Um, so yeah, there is going to be another video on this topic of rational demand avoidance slash irrational demand avoidance split, which is going to be talking about who gets to decide what is irrational or irrational demand avoidance, because that's quite an interesting topic in itself. So yeah, may one stimming activities many and one of face days long, which is equivalent to live long and prosper. And I hope one is having a good time, a week, and etc. Goodbye.